In recent decades, 28th President Woodrow Wilson has been considered one of the most controversial United States presidents for a variety of reasons, including the arrest of political opponent Eugene Debs. During Wilson's administration, over 2,000 people were arrested for violating the Espionage and Sedition Acts. Debs' arrest was especially notable. He'd been a longtime leader of the socialist movement in the United States and had been one of the four prominent contenders in the 1912 presidential election, along with Wilson. Much of the discussion about the arrest centers on issues of freedom of speech and imprisonment of political opponents. Less is said of Wilson's personal thoughts on Debs. However, letters to and from Wilson indicate that he had strong opinions on Debs, the length of his sentence, and his eventual release under the following administration. On June 30th, 1918, Debs was arrested for a speech delivered in Canton, Ohio, in which he advocated resistance to the military draft. The speech was ultimately ruled to be in violation of the Espionage and Sedition Acts, which were designed to prevent citizen interference in the war effort. In early August, about a month after Debs' arrest, socialist author and activist Upton Sinclair wrote to Wilson on behalf of many of those imprisoned under the Espionage and Sedition Acts, including Debs, asking for better conditions. He made a distinction between anti-war prisoners who were plotting with the enemy and those like Debs, who, according to him, were opposed to the war on, quote, religious or humanitarian grounds, and, quote, who have given a lifetime's devotion to the highest ideals of humanity, and whose only fault is that they have not been able to adjust their minds to the present and desperate emergency. Wilson deferred to his Attorney General, Thomas Watt Gregory. Gregory, who is often considered the architect of the Espionage Act, believed it was working as intended, and that making special provisions in any way for the likes of Debs could be interpreted as an apology by the administration and might encourage more dissent. Even Gregory, however, didn't consider men such as Debs to be traitors. He stated they had, quote, not the slightest sympathy with the enemy and had exclusive loyalty to the United States. Wilson continued to defer to Gregory's stance, at least throughout the war. In letters, he seemed to state no strong feelings of his own, and if anything, seemed to be inclined towards better treatment for Debs, if a practical case for doing so could be made. Debs was no stranger to Wilson. As mentioned, they'd both contended for the presidency in 1912. In a four-way race, Debs certainly wasn't Wilson's main opponent, but his ability to capture 6% of the popular vote, or over 900,000 votes, proved he wasn't insignificant. Debs received national attention decades prior in 1894 for leading a massive labor strike when he was president of the American Railway Union. Based on Wilson's letters, he was indirectly affected when one of his speeches had a smaller turnout than expected, due to transportation problems caused by the strikers. In the following decades, Debs transitioned from labor leader to socialist activist. By the time of Wilson's presidency, there's no doubt Wilson was well aware of Debs and his socialist movement. Early in Wilson's second term, there were talks in some circles to have a meeting in the White House between the two. Senate Majority Leader Whip J. Hamilton Lewis said he had it on good authority that Debs would come out and, quote, oppose all socialists who were using socialism as opposition to the nation's war. If Wilson first sent for Debs, asked for support in the war, and met with Debs in the White House, Lewis warned that Wilson should only go through with such a meeting if he had a solid assurance that Debs would actually arrive. As he warned, quote, he must not be left to say that you invited him, and he declined. He also warned that the whole matter may have been a ploy on Debs' part to compete for leadership within the Socialist Party with a rival, whereas the actual contents of the meeting wouldn't have mattered much. Wilson concurred with Lewis's assessment, stating that it would have been a serious embarrassment to potentially involve himself in something dealing with internal Socialist Party politics. Months later, a pro-war socialist editor wrote to a close Wilson advisor saying he believed he could switch Debs to their side if he could only arrange a meeting with Debs. Ultimately, no effort to change Debs' mind was successful. In fact, as anti-war socialists were getting arrested, he he only felt emboldened to fight alongside his brothers and sisters in the cause. Debs' prison sentence was 10 years long, meaning, already at 62 years old, he'd be 72 at the time of his release, set for 1928. In the end, he wouldn't serve even half of the sentence, though his eventual release was not at all thanks to Wilson. By the end of Wilson's presidency, he'd made no move to pardon Debs, lessen his sentence, or improve his conditions. The war officially ended in November of 1918, less than 2 months after Debs' sentencing. Yet, for the next 2.5 years, Debs' condition remained the same. Today, Wilson's treatment of Debs is seen as controversial and even cruel. However, it can't be understated how divisive of a figure Debs was in his own time. He wasn't merely a political candidate, but was seen as an agitator, spreading disorder. And while Debs consistently advocated for nonviolence, many believed violence was the inevitable outcome of his movement. Many prominent figures had negative opinions of him or negative experiences with him. Grover Cleveland was president when Debs led the Pullman strike in 1894. His administration deployed federal troops to deal with the strikers, with the justification that the strikers were obstructing the transport of federal mail. Debs even wrote a letter to Cleveland explaining his position. However, Cleveland always maintained that he'd acted correctly. Democratic presidential candidate William Jennings Bryan, who himself was considered a radical by many, feared what Debs meant for national politics. Bryan and his populists had essentially conducted a takeover of the Democratic Party, and he feared Debs and his socialists might do something similar. Theodore Roosevelt had referenced Debs as an undesirable citizen on multiple occasions and blamed him for causing, quote, bloodshed, anarchy, and riot. He routinely used Debs as an example of radicalism and what could happen if certain ideas weren't properly addressed. Beyond public figures, Debs was still controversial. During the Pullman strike, a New York Times editorial called him, quote, a lawbreaker at large and an enemy of the human race. The New York Tribune even said that Debs was worse than villains of American history such as Benedict Arnold, Aaron Burr, and Jefferson Davis. Veterans groups formed Keep Debs in Prison campaigns as retaliation for his protesting, and even the Ku Klux Klan disliked him for his vocal support of African Americans. Debs' ideas clashed with fundamental values of average Americans. He proclaimed the Bolsheviks had established the first government truly run by the people, that Christianity supported socialism, and he compared the socialist cause with that of the abolitionist. Many were disturbed not only by the radical ideas, but also their spread. Roosevelt remarked that the movement was, quote, far more ominous than any populist or similar movement in the past. And this was in no small part due to the movement having a likable and intelligent man such as Debs at the front. While many of Debs' ideas may have seemed apocryphal, he had, as historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. put it, a, quote, profoundly intuitive understanding of the American people. Schlesinger added, quote, men and women loved Debs even when they hated his doctrine. Debs provided a face for the anti-war movement at large. Historian, professor, and author Ernest Freeburg wrote of Debs, quote, he was the only prisoner who had a face and voice, the one who provoked citizens to either defend or oppose their government's prosecution of wartime dissenters. Debs had also used his position to directly attack Wilson's policies. At his trial, he declared that if the Espionage and Sedition Acts were upheld, then the Constitution was dead. The White House received petitions by the truckload for Debs, but these petitions perhaps couldn't have been sent to a less sympathetic man. By the end of his presidency, Wilson was firmly committed to keeping Debs in prison. Initially, this wasn't the case, or at least didn't seem to be based on Wilson's writings. With the war over, there were renewed requests for Debs' freedom. In early 1919, Wilson said he was willing to grant Debs respite if his attorney general agreed, but also said that he personally doubted the wisdom in doing so. His new attorney general, A. Mitchell Palmer, stated that Debs' sentence was too long and his sentence needed to be commuted. However, he also stated it wasn't the proper time citing that Debs had only been in prison for a few months at this point and was completely unrepentant, that a large number of Americans would be outraged by his release, and that radical factions would be emboldened. He advised to wait until the peace treaty was signed and passions in the nation had cooled. But even after the treaty was signed, there was no commutation of Debs' sentence. Months later, a request came from Upton Sinclair, requesting immediate release of Debs on grounds of his poor health. Wilson asked Palmer to look into the matter, and Palmer reported back that, according to his inquiry, Debs was in fine condition. Repeated requests for pardons or at least commutation of Debs' sentence came and were denied by Wilson in a professional, polite, and succinct manner. Quote, "I found with a great deal of distress, after looking into the case, that I could not in good conscience grant the pardon you suggest." Another letter read, quote, "I am sorry that my judgment differs from yours in the matter, and that I do not deem it wise to pardon him." This behavior was not entirely out of line with Wilson's earlier attitude. The truly jarring action, however, was Wilson's response when his own Attorney General requested Debs' release. The letter was written by Palmer in January of 1921. By this point, Wilson's successor, Warren G. Harding, had already been elected and was set to take office in less than 2 months. Palmer stated that there was simply very little grounds for keeping Debs imprisoned, as, in Palmer's eyes, Debs was no longer any kind of danger and had been adequately punished. In fact, Palmer suggested that, by this point, Debs had been severely punished, citing his age at 65 years. Palmer further remarked on Wilson's unusual treatment of the Debs case. In other cases where people were arrested for anti-war activities, Wilson had commuted sentences of 10, 15, and even 20 years down to fractions of their original time. Palmer's requested release date for Debs, February 12, 1921, would make his sentence equal to 1 year and 10 months, the same as the average commuted sentence of those sentenced to 15 years. In this light, he argued that not commuting the sentence of Debs, which was 10 years, would, quote, be to invite criticism of a discriminating character. In the lengthy letter, Palmer appeared to be practically begging Wilson for at least a reason for the unusual treatment. Wilson's only response was to return Palmer's letter with a single word inked across the front in all capital letters: denied. Wilson's seemingly drastic change in attitude towards Debs has been speculated on. Historian Ernest Freeberg said that the stroke Wilson suffered in late 1919 and never fully recovered from made him, quote, lose his moral compass. It's also possible he was bitter over the numerous failures he suffered during his second term. Americans were largely against his idea of joining the League of Nations. His 14 points, essentially recommendations for lasting international peace, were largely rejected, and the agitation caused by his wartime actions made Americans long for another Republican president. It was all the more devastating considering Wilson, though partially paralyzed at the time, still desired a third presidential term. It's been suggested that, for whatever reason, Wilson harbored a personal grudge against Debs. As noted by contemporaries and modern historians, Wilson was prone to holding grudges and being stubborn and vindictive, traits which, in public, he kept hidden behind a very refined demeanor. Some also say that these traits were only exemplified after his stroke. And perhaps it's possible that even as he wrote polite and professional letters on the subject of Debs, he never planned to pardon or commute his sentence, and always despised him. Joseph P. Tumulty, Wilson's private secretary during the entirety of his presidency, recalled a particularly angry tirade from Wilson. Quote, I will never consent to the pardon of this man. I know that in certain quarters of the country there is a popular demand for the pardon of Debs, but it shall never be accomplished with my consent. Were I to consent to it, I should never be able to look into the faces of the mothers of this country who sent their boys to the other side, while the flower of American youth was pouring out its blood to vindicate the cause of civilization. This man Debs stood behind the lines, sniping, attacking, and denouncing them. Before the war, he had a perfect right to exercise his freedom of speech and to express his own opinion, but after the Congress of the United States declared war, silence on his part would have been the proper course to pursue. I know there will be a great deal of denunciation of me for refusing this pardon. They will say I am cold-blooded and indifferent, but it will make no impression on me. This man was a traitor to his country, and he will never be pardoned during my administration. Notably, this stood in contrast to even Attorney General Gregory's opinion that, whatever could be said of Debs, he was no traitor. On March 2, 1921, just 2 days before leaving office, Wilson had written a letter addressing why he wouldn't release Debs. Quote, "I am sure you will understand, and that, if I could have explained the situation to you, you would feel that I was without blame in the matter." Wilson's successor took office on March 4, 1921. Harding was by no means a socialist, but was looking to recover the nation from Wilson's widely unpopular administration. As part of this agenda, he commuted Debs' sentence to end in December of 1921, saying he wanted Debs to be able to spend Christmas with his wife. Not only this, but he invited Debs to the White House and gave him a warm reception. Upon obtaining his freedom, Debs continued to promote the socialist cause. He died in 1926, at age 70, from heart failure, which many attribute to the conditions he suffered in prison. Wilson wasn't alive to comment on Debs' fate, as Wilson died about 2 years earlier in 1924, but it's hard to imagine he'd have any sympathy. A journalist who met with Wilson 5 months after the freeing of Debs recounted what was perhaps Wilson's most biting condemnation of the man. Quote, "Debs never should have been released. Debs was one of the worst men in the country. He should have stayed in the penitentiary." The journalist added her own comment on Wilson. Quote, "When you run up against this side of Mr. Wilson's mind, you are touching on one of the reasons why so many people who came in contact with him hated him. He is inflexible in his judgments." If you enjoyed this video, you can browse this channel for more videos on United States presidents from George Washington to Donald Trump, discussing their careers, personal lives, and places in history.